OK, let's take our next question. It comes from Edgar Liu in the studio.
Well, 17 years ago, the Chinese Communist Party promised that SARS was under control, and they were caught red-handed lying. Then they promised again to be transparent in future disease control, now which we all saw how that turned out. 19 years ago, the Chinese Communist Party promised a lot to join WTO, the World Trade Organization, and many were never implemented, despite the enormous economic interest out of the deal. 36 years ago, the Chinese Communist Party promised to leave Hong Kong alone for at least 50 years. They didn't even live up to half of it. Now, I lived through all these unfulfilled pledges as a Chinese citizen. Now, as an Australian citizen, I would like to know some very good reasons why we should trust such a notorious promise keeper with another 40 years pledge to presumably save the world.
Just before I go to the panel, do you trust the Chinese Communist Party?
I think you can tell that from my question.
A very diplomatic response. Yeah. Marion Wilkinson. Is China to be trusted on all of these things, including its new climate pledge, which is pretty ambitious?
Well, I guess I might separate the climate pledge from perhaps some of the other pledges. I think on the climate pledge, there's reasons, very good reasons for China to take that seriously, because in fact its economy is going to be fundamentally dependent on whether it can shift to a clean energy economy like everyone else. It knows that the Europeans and a Biden administration, if Joe Biden gets into the White House, is going to do things like penalise carbon-intensive manufacturing. So I think it is in China's interests to move and to move more quickly.
So you think, given all of those examples of China breaking its promises, that we should back this one?
I think so, because China tends to, like most emerging and other superpowers, they act in their own interests. And in this case, I think it is in China's interests. Obviously, on other instances, whether it's Hong Kong or whether it's other pledges, we know that any government, but particularly authoritarian governments, will act in a way that they think serves their interests. Clearly, what they're doing in Hong Kong at the moment, they think that does serve their interests. But whether that's right, whether that's morally right, is another question altogether. But I think that certainly on the climate change issue, this is an issue that fundamentally goes to the question of the Chinese economy and whether it can maintain a path of growth and a path of big export growth.
Yuan Zhang, is China to be believed on such big promises?
So I agree with you that, China has committed a lot of, say, human rights violations in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, Tibet, and now we're seeing in the Mongolia as well. But I agree with Marianne as well that China tends to act in its interest. And I think that in terms of climate, it is in its interest to act now for several reasons. One is that climate change is a big sticking point, wedge issue between the European Union and the United States. And for China to make such a big announcement will placate some of Europeans and basically isolate the United States. So that's in its international interest. And two, doing more on climate change also makes it more influential in, for example, Pacific Island countries. Australia is quite concerned about China's influence in the Pacific, but we know that the Pacific countries are especially concerned about climate change and rising sea levels. So in that, China can gain. And third one, for its economy as well, as Marianne has mentioned, that China is looking to be more self-sufficient. And right now, it is relying quite heavily on Australia's exports to China, fossil fuel exports. By being more self-sufficient, then it can rely less on...
So, Mike, how does this change the picture for Australia? If this big customer of ours is changing its course on energy, what does that mean for us?
Look, fundamentally, I think it's even more worrying. If we weren't already worried about our fossil fuel industry, we should be even more worried, right? China will not only get out of importing coal and importing gas and other things over the next, they've said 40 years, but for coal, it's in the next 20 years. They will get out of Australian products of those even faster. They will prioritise domestic supply, one would have to believe.
And to Edgar's question, do you believe them with their ambitions?
Oh, I believe so, because they're also trying to put their economy into a structurally better place. So they'll have a lower cost of doing business in China as a result of all of these investments. So it's not purely around a climate change angle for them. It is about putting their economy in the best position. And lastly, they also want to control all the source technologies. They're a very long-term thinking nation. And very cleverly have controlled a lot of the source technologies in the renewable era that we're entering into. From panels to batteries to electric vehicles, AI for grids, etc. They control and are the major producer of those technologies. So that's incredibly good for them.